I've already heard some people reminding me what we covered last week. So what did we do last week? You can tell me.
We started out with Esau. Then we went to the Edomites and the Agagites and the Amalekites and some other ite, and we're all we live in the flesh. We're sinful.
You got it. That's it. I was like, why did it take me an hour to say what you just said? It's like, that's phenomenal.
You're long-winded. You're long.
Well, thanks, baby. Right. So you have Esau over the Edomites, and the Amalekites come from them, and then the Agagites come from them, and the whole thing represents the flesh.
Right.
These are real people, but God used this history and orchestrated this history to show the difference between walking in the Spirit and walking in the flesh.
So how did you shame us?
Huh?
How did you shame us?
Because every class I come in here and I say, well, who remembers what we did last week? And nobody has. And it's like, so rather than own the disappointment, I shamed y'all. And now y'all just did that. And it's really just about making me feel good that you paid attention last week.
We pay attention
That's
every week.
Huh? I don't know.
It's just
Okay.
a long time.
It's just, I'm just long-winded. I know. Betty told me. Right. So good, very good. That's right. So where we are in the story is they've crossed over the Red Sea. God has delivered his people. But it's not just about deliverance. Because the outline that I had told you in a few times is God delivers his people and God dwells with his people. And I think as Christians, even we as Christians sometimes think it's all about salvation. And forget, yes, you are saved, but you are saved for a purpose. And that's what we see here in the Exodus. They are saved from Egypt, but not to go be free on their own, but to have the freedom that comes from serving the true and the living God, being in a relationship with him. And so God is training his children, and in particular his child Israel, my firstborn son Israel. Right? And so he does that, and he gives them a series of tests. And in those tests, you know, they get thirsty, they get hungry, they grumble against God, they grumble against Moses. And Moses says, you think you're grumbling against me, but you're really grumbling against God. I'm just his messenger. And God keeps telling him, if you will listen to me, it'll be a beautiful relationship. Why won't you listen to me? You know. And so he's teaching them. Last week, we saw the beginning of adversity from the outside coming in. And so they start getting attacked by the Amalekites. And that's the whole thing that Mary helped us just remember a minute ago. This week, we see more of normal life. And so that's what we're seeing. They're dwelling in the wilderness. And all the things that comes with living amongst the people and with the people, they're starting to experience. And so that's where we pick our story up. And so we are in Exodus 18. We're going to cover all of it. And it's a fun chapter. I got to get one of those big print glasses. All right.
You're in the right group.
I'm in that group.
You're in the right group.
Yes, well, good. All right. So 18, verse 1. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home, with her 2 sons. So we'll pause there. So you'll remember when Moses had left Egypt, fled out of Egypt because he had killed the Egyptian taskmaster. He thought, I'm going to deliver this people, and they rejected him. And then Pharaoh wanted to kill Moses, so he flees into the wilderness, and he meets a woman. And he marries her, and he lives with her family. The father was Jethro. Then God appears to him in the burning bush and says, you're going to go rescue my people. Moses has all the objections, but he ends up going. And we never really learn what happens to his family. There's this one incident on the way where Zipporah has to circumcise his son, and She says, you're a bridegroom of blood to me. Moses was supposed to do that and he didn't do it. And then you don't hear. So chapter 18 here tells us Moses had sent them home. So it must have gotten too difficult in either on the way to Egypt or what they were going to face in Egypt that he sent his family back to her parents' house to be safe. So this guy Jethro. Now so I have this on your sheet, and this is interesting and confusing. And to me, it's more just interesting. But in Exodus chapter 2, so you're talking about all the way, basically back to the beginning, in chapter 2, verse 16, he's called Ruel. Okay, so now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father, Ruel, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? So he's called the priest of Midian. He's the one with the 7 daughters, and then his name is Ruel. Yet, just a few verses later, it's chapter 3, verse 1, it says, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And so people said, well, what is it? Is he Ruel or is he Jethro? I mean, it's highly unlikely that Moses made a mistake. Even if this wasn't the inspired word of God, it's just a few verses later. You wouldn't get the wrong name, right? So I think it's just 2 names for the same person. Just like Simon is Peter. And sometimes he's called Simon, right? Jesus even calls him Simon. And sometimes he calls him Peter. And sometimes the Gospels tell you, and Simon, who is Peter, right? And so this is a common thing. So no big deal, Ruel, Jethro. The confusion comes when you get to Hobab. You guys know about Hobab. We hear about him in Judges and Numbers, but we'll look at Judges first, and I'll just jump there. It's Judges 4:11, but okay. Okay, so in the Judges, this is years and years later. Joshua had conquered the land and all that, but there's a reflection back. Now, Heber, the Kenite, had separated from the Kenites the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses. So now we have a little bit more confusion. We have Ruel and Jethro, and now it's saying that Hobab is the father-in-law of Moses. And so people try to reconcile that and say, well, maybe Moses had multiple wives, even though there's no evidence of that. So which is it, So, one more place, Numbers 10:29. I'm going to help show us how to reconcile all this. And again, it's just interesting. So Numbers 10:29. And Moses said to Hobab, the son of Ruel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. So, while Judges says that Hobab was Moses' father-in-law, Numbers says that Hobab was Ruel's son. Okay? And Ruel and Jethro are the same person. So if we accept that Ruel and Jethro are the same person, and Hobab is that person's son, then it all fits together. So then you say, well, wait, why does it call him his father-in-law in the book of Judges? Well, the easiest explanation for this, and I think it is just very plausible and makes perfect sense, is how many of you heard in the Hebrew, the original Hebrew, there's no vowels?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So it's all just consonants in the original Hebrew. Then as scribes over the centuries began to flesh this out, and they would put vowels, and the vowels in Hebrew are very complicated. They're the little dots and the jots and tittles. The little dots and commas and weird things around a letter fill in the vowels. So why am I telling you that? Well, the Hebrew word for brother-in-law and the Hebrew word for father-in-law, they're exactly the same from the consonant standpoint. It's only the vowels that change them. So probably when a scribe was filling in the vowels in the earliest manuscripts that we still have left, they filled them in wrong and they made him father-in-law. Anyway, so just an interesting, really doesn't mean anything except to show when people point out supposed contradictions in Scripture, there are very often very plausible explanations for these things that should not be that hard to believe. We have no original manuscript. All the manuscripts we have are later, and it's okay. That's just a normal thing. They're not even that much later, particularly when you come to the Old Testament, the New Testament. But there's explanations. Okay. So Moses' father-in-law comes back. He's heard, the point of this really is, he's heard all that God has done for this people. And that's been the point all along. Like we've said, why would God go through these plagues? 10 plagues. I mean, all they had to do was just take them out, or just annihilate the Egyptians. But this long drawn out thing, why do you have to take them through the Red Sea? Yeah. And it was to show who he was. Remember, back to the beginning, that you may know that I am the Lord. And here, the father-in-law is basically saying that. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And so the word spread. Now, that's Exodus 18. We see after the Red Sea crossing, the Israelites themselves say that kind of statement, like, wow, look at all that the Lord had did. He rescued us. But even in Joshua, in the future, it's still referred to. And nations were afraid of the children of Israel because of the Israelites, because they man, look what God did to Egypt, the biggest world power, brought them to nothing. I mean, Egypt wasn't just a little country, And so Moses' father-in-law comes. So we're in verse 3. So to Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home, and along with her 2 sons, the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land, and the name of the other is Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he had encamped at the mountain of God. So now they're at the actual mountain, Mount Sinai. So the names, earlier in Exodus, we only ever heard of Gershom. And he said, I call him Gershom because I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And we hear that over and over, even in the New Testament. We are strangers in a strange land, even on earth here, as citizens of heaven. Again, going back to that idea. So the word Gershom is from the word foreigner or stranger or sojourner. So he named his son basically stranger, which is a strange thing, these Hebrews naming their kids what they do. Eleazar, because the God of my father was my help. So apparently this child was born sometime after, at whatever point, we don't know. But how do you know if he says the God of my father was my help, can you derive that from that name?
God.
Yel, right?
Yeah.
So El, that's God. El Shaddai, and El is God. It's not Yahweh. It's not the covenant name of God, but is the name. It's the word for God. So El is God, and then Azar is help.
Mm-hmm.
And so the God of help is that son's name. So we'll go on. 6. And when he sent word to Moses, when he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and your 2 sons with her. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. Then Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. isn't like family reunions meant to be, and you just want to enjoy what the Lord has done for you with your loved ones, and that's what's happening here. That's what he's sharing. Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord." Now Jethro uses the covenant name of God, Yahweh, the Lord, capital Lord in our Bibles. "Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people." So the Egyptians dealt arrogantly with God's people, and God delivered them. "And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God." This is fascinating. And again, it's one of those cases in the scriptures that we see all throughout the Old Testament of Gentiles coming to faith in the covenant God of Israel. Okay? And it's just a reminder that the gospel is spreading among nations. And this goes all the way. I mean, you see with Solomon, why is the Queen of Sheba coming to Solomon to see all that God had done? You know? And this is what it is. So I think I'd have to go back, and it's kind of occurring to me, but I think this is even the first actual worship of God after they've come out of Egypt. I don't remember if there's reference to that during the song of Moses and Miriam. So here you have a Gentile worshiping God, sacrificing a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. Some more references. Again, this stuff's kind of on your sheet, but 1 Kings 17:24 is the widow of Zarephath, where Elijah is told to go, I forget the town, and to go there, and he stays with this widow, and he produces food for her, and he also raises her son from the dead. And Jesus in the Gospels will say there were plenty of widows needing help in Israel, but Elijah was sent out of Israel to the Gentile land to do this. And she says the same thing. Now I know. In other words, based on what I'm seeing, now I know that that Yahweh is God, the most powerful God. Naaman, the Syrian general in 2 Kings, he's the one, he was a leper, but he was a very powerful general for Syria, and he goes to Elijah to be healed, and they tell him to bathe in the Jordan 7 times, right? Remember that? And again, this is a great connection to the Mark series that we're doing, because here you have John the Baptist baptizing in the Jordan, and here you have a Gentile basically baptized in the Jordan. Well, it's not a baptism. And he doesn't want to do it because the Jordan, he's like, we got cleaner rivers where I'm from. Why do you want me to go in that dirty river? And he does, and he becomes clean. And then he goes back and he says, now I know Yahweh is the God. And so all through the Old Testament, we have non-Jewish people coming to faith. And the implication is people are probably coming to faith through them. And so that's what you got going on here. And verse 11, he says, the Lord is greater than all the gods of Egypt, or than all the gods, particularly because what does God do in the plagues? What were the plagues showing?
Ask it again.
Ask the question.
The question is, what was God showing in the 10 plagues to the Egyptians?
Who he was.
He was taking each one of their gods down.
Yeah, he was showing, he's exercising his authority over those gods, over the sun god, over the Nile god, over every one of them was a god. I gave you that chart, right? And so God shows as he kind of deconstructs their religious system in Egypt. So I say it's a sweet reunion. I mean, it really is meant to be. You got to think they're exhausted, you know. They just fought that battle. Do you remember last week, if you remember, they were being attacked by the Amalekites. Moses had to, and they were tired, and that was the point, right? They're walking through the desert, hungry and thirsty. God is feeding them and giving them water, but still, I mean, that's, 2 million people, right? And so, and now they get a sweet reunion. And it says Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifice to God, and Aaron, with all the elders of Israel, came to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So it's just a nice picture of that. And we get that kind of cyclically in the Exodus. Do you remember what happens after the bitter waters are turned sweet and they can drink them back in Exodus 15? So they come through the Red Sea, 3 days in, they're thirsty, they're complaining, they're bitter, the waters are bitter. Moses throws a tree in the waters, they can drink them now. And then from there, they're taken to
Like an oasis.
like an oasis, right? A paradise that they just get to hang out. There's 70 palm trees and there's water and, you know. And so every time there's sort of, and I won't say every time, but there's quite a bit of ordeal and difficulty, but there's these pictures of respite in the midst of the wilderness. And I think for the Christian, that's true too. You know, we go through struggles and sometimes we go through dark seasons, but then we come out and we just get to relax and see the glory of God, we praise the glory of God. We may not understand everything. You know, they certainly don't understand everything, but you get these glimpses. So now Jethro and Moses talk, and this is kind of the next segment of this story here. So verse 13, the next day Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people?" By the way, I love the way the Bible's written. Like, when he saw all that he was doing for the people, he says, "What is this you're doing for the people?" It's like kind of like that repetition, you know. "Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning until evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another. And I make them know the statutes of God and his laws." Verse 17, Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." Why does he say, it's obvious why Moses would get worn out, right? Would he say that the people would wear themselves out?
I'm standing there all day long.
Yeah, and what happens when you end up grumbling, right? And fighting, and, you know, that's right. Everybody's gonna get worn out without good leadership. Now obey my voice. Okay, so you have this back and forth between Jethro and Moses, where Jethro asks a question, and Moses gives the answer, and then Jethro gives the assessment. Well, that's not good. This is not sustainable. And you got to think, right? Like, this is a really human, real moment, aside from just like the work of God and the people sinning, and like people are trying to live life, right? They're just trying to live life, and there's conflicts, and there's things arising, and God is really showing how we need a system, we need an organization, we need to work through these things. Like, sometimes we think the daily business of life is not as important as the more spiritual stuff, you know. And the truth is, that sacred secular divide, God cares very much about what our day-to-day is. And we see he sends Jethro to Moses to help work that out, because our day-to-day affects our spiritual. It affects our ability to worship, it affects our ability to relate to one another.
George, one time I
Yeah.
heard somebody share that when he listened to Jethro, that his authority got diminished. Now, I didn't agree with how they, I didn't know what to think of it, but that's how they summarized it. That he was actually, instead of listening to the Lord and doing it the way Moses was told to do it, he listened to Jethro instead, and that it diminished Moses' authority over the people by him handing off. And
Well, I think there's a reality that when you delegate, you're now giving authority that you consolidated into the hands of others. So there's some truth to that, but that's biblical. You know, Moses is not meant to carry the burdens of 2 million people. You know, and we're going to see that. You know, so Jethro's advice is, now obey my advice, or now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God. And you shall warn them about the statutes and laws and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do. And so Jethro's all in on this God. Yes, your job is to help them know the word of God. Moreover, look for able men from all people. And this is coming from Jethro, this Gentile. Men who fear God, who are trustworthy, and hate a bribe. And so you see almost there like sort of some basic like principles for elders, right? And in the New Testament we're going to see much more. But the first principle is God-fearing men. They put God first. And the next is they're trustworthy, so they have a good report among others, and they hate a bribe, they hate evil. And so you see those kind of 3 characteristics that fit very well with what the New Testament in Titus or Timothy says about elders. And place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, and let them judge the people at all times. And every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, God will direct you, and you'll be able to endure it. And all this people also will go to their place in peace. I think this is so important, and it relates directly back to the last scene. So the battle scene, what was Moses doing during the battle?
Hold his arms up.
Yeah.
He was holding his arms up, right? And then what happened?
They got
He
tied
couldn't
up.
hold his arms up. And so he had to get guys there to hold his arms up. And, 2 of them, or however many. And that's the point. And now you see, once again, he's not able to do it all. And that's the point. Moses can't believe his own press, that he's this great ruler, and he is not meant to be in place of God. Yeah.
And Jethro also qualifies that when he said, if you do this thing, and so God commands you.
Oh, where do you see, what verse?
23.
23. So Moses
Yeah.
was to talk to God about that
God
before he
will.
instituted this thing
Yeah,
to get God's approval on it.
yeah. That's good.
And
that's a good
he was to teach these guys. He wasn't just to throw them out there, on their own. Back in 20, then teach them the statutes and the laws,
Mhm.
and make known to them the way in which they are to walk.
That's great. And we see Jesus following this pattern, don't we? The very first thing he does when he enters his ministry, he starts calling disciples.
Yeah.
And from the disciples, he'll pick 12 that he's pouring into these 12, so that the 12 can then go out, So yeah. Now, Deuteronomy, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 1, I believe. Hopefully I have it in your sheet. Yeah, Deuteronomy 1, 9, 18. Moses reminds the people of this incident. Now this is the reason I show you this is not just because it's a cross-reference, because Moses is going to explain the scenario, leaving some details out. And we see this in the Gospels too, right? Where one Gospel writer will tell an account, and he'll only talk about one person in the account. And then another Gospel writer will tell the same story, but maybe he'll mention 2 people. And people say, oh, look, that's a contradiction. This says 1, this says 2. No, it's a different perspective, right? And so here you have Moses' perspective on this as he's reminding the people. Verse 9. Deuteronomy 1:9. At that time I said to you, I am not able to bear you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, make you 1,000 times as many as you are, and bless you as he promised you. How can I bear by myself the weight and burden of you and your strife? Choose for your tribes wise understanding and experienced men, and I will appoint them as your heads. And you answered me, the thing you have spoken is good for us to do. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise, experienced men, and set them as heads over you, commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds. And I charged your judges at the time, hear the cases between your brothers, and judge righteously between a man and his brother, or the alien who is with them. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall, and he explains it, right? So Moses leaves out the fact that his father-in-law gave him the idea. Big deal. This is 40 years later. It would be as if I have a meeting with the elders here at the church, and we, as a group, decided something, and I explain to the church, okay, this is what we decided, this is what we're going to do. And 2 years down the road, I'm reminding you of that, and I'd say, don't you remember when I told you that we were going to make this change at the church, and we made this change? At that point, it's not like I'm taking credit for it. I'm just relaying something you know about from the past. It doesn't preclude the fact that it went through our elders first. And that's how you understand some of this, okay? So it's not like, wait a minute, what happened? Moses is just reminding them of exactly what happened from their perspective. So that's the kind of Deuteronomy connection. But it also shows this is a significant moment in the life of Israel to remember. I mean, if Moses is bringing it up again in Deuteronomy, so Exodus is about how they got out, but Deuteronomy is like they're about to enter the land and Moses isn't allowed to go, and he's reminding them of everything. So 40 years later, he's reminding the people. And I'm guessing this is the second generation at this point. And so maybe he's reminding the children of the people. You know, this is how we got here. You all think you need me, and I'm glad God used me, but I'm going to be gone. Joshua's going to be taking over. But remember, it's not about Joshua. We set over you multiple elders. You know, and that's how that works. So, in the New Testament, we have all kinds of passages similar to this. If you look at Acts 6, it's sort of the first mention of how that would work, with deacons in particular. Acts 6 doesn't use the word deacon, but it certainly seems like that's what's going on there. Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews, because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. So the church is made up of Jewish Christians now, but they were Jewish, but Hellenists, which means people from the Greek world. And so they're in the church, and the Greek people are saying, hey, the Jewish people are getting favoritism. And they're bringing this to the elders. So 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, it is not right that we should give up preaching and the word of God to serve tables. Now, this is not a derogatory statement. Again, remember, this is in translation, right? Probably said in, maybe it's even said in Aramaic, it's translated into Greek, it's translated into English. They're not saying that's menial work that we're not meant to do. They're saying, look, the Lord has placed us to focus on prayer and on teaching. We can't be solving everybody's problems. We need help. That's what it's saying. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. You see the same pattern that Moses did in Deuteronomy. You pick them out from among yourselves and will appoint them. And that's what Moses said. Pick from among yourselves and I will empower them, or however he worded it. You know. And here you see the same thing. And this is kind of our model for why we ask you all to nominate deacons and elders. Because the scriptures are showing it should come from, the congregation should recognize these are people of God, men of God, and they're of good reputation, they're people of their word, and they hate evil. Then, though, it's still up to the existing leadership to validate that. Because the existing leadership might see things that y'all don't know. They might be privy to private stuff that you don't know. And so that's the pattern that's going on there. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. And what they said pleased the whole gathering. Sounds, again, very similar to that Deuteronomy passage, where people said, yeah, that's a good idea, Moses. And they chose Stephen, a man full of faith, of the Holy Spirit, and Philip, and they list these names. And totally a side note to what we're talking about here, but the names are all Greek names. In other words, they empowered the minority. You know, this is like, I know like affirmative action gets a bad sort of connotation out in the workplace and stuff, but what we're seeing here in the church is them taking the minority group, the oppressed group, and saying, we want you guys to be leaders and you do this work. So we see here the beginnings of elders and deacons within the life of the early church, because there's a group that are devoted to prayer and teaching, and there's a group that are devoted to physical needs of people. You have the passages there, Titus, Timothy. I guess we're not out of time yet, so we can look at some of this. 1 Timothy 3. First Timothy 3:1, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. So the office of overseer, this word is the word that's used for elder. There's a number of words in the New Testament to refer to this office. Overseer, shepherd, presbyter, or bishop. So there's various words. Shepherd is where we get our word pastor. So an overseer, he desires a noble task. So maybe the Lord is stirring up in a person if they have the call to be an elder. And that's why that's not a bad thing. You always want that validation. Like if you're always trying to convince somebody to be an elder who's saying, I don't feel that call, you may be going against what the Spirit is doing. There should be an inner testimony of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not lover of money. He must manage his household well with dignity, keeping his children submissive, for if anyone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? So, in seeing how he pastors his home, it'll give you an idea of how he will pastor the church. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. That doesn't mean he can't be young. Remember, Paul's writing to Timothy, who was young. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. And we'll probably just stop there from this section. Then there's the qualifications of deacon. They're very similar, except the deacon doesn't have the requirement to be able to teach well. He still has to have a good report among people. He has to have a servant's heart. The word deacon means servant. So oftentimes the word deacon is used in the New Testament, not even related to the office, but there's clearly an office because chapter 3, verse 8, there's deacons likewise must be dignified, and so it spells out what a deacon must be as a formal office. So there is a general sense by which we're all deacons, we're all servants. So sometimes Paul will use that, this person was a deacon or that person, they're servants. That's just the word in the Greek. However, there's an office that they have special qualifications, and you see it there. The last thing I'll show you on that is 1 Timothy 5. This is how we get the ruling elder and teaching elder distinction in Presbyterianism. So you all call me pastor, I'm a reverend, I'm a minister, ordained. Within the Presbyterian Church, I'm called a teaching elder. And then we have a group of men called ruling elders, who Jesse's a ruling elder, there's ruling. And so what's the difference? Is one ordained and the other not ordained? No, these men are ordained, which means their hands are laid upon them and they are called to the task of shepherding. They are shepherds. But there seems to be a distinction, and it's not one of authority. I don't have authority over, teaching elders don't have authority over the ruling elders, but there seems to be a difference of roles. So 1 Timothy 5:17 is partially where we get this. Let the elders who rule well, that's that ruling part, be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. Did you get that, right? Let the elders who rule well be considered of double honor. So there's elders, and then especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. So that means there's elders, and then there's a group of elders who are set apart for the specific task of teaching and preaching. And so that's why we have, how we have elders in our church. We have ruling elders and teaching elders. Teaching elders need to go to seminary or at least have theological training that's, and pass tests at the presbytery level. Ruling elders are within the church. That's how that all works. So, as usual, that was all a mouthful. But I don't want to rush out of here. So, what stands out to you guys about this whole passage? Whether it's the first half, the reunion of the family, or the second half, the division of the labor, the work. Does anything stand out to you? Go ahead.
Well, I don't understand that's the right word. To me, you know, they're both historical events that fill in the gap that is interesting to know. So it's sort of like, in my opinion, it's tit for tat. I mean, as far as what the standing out. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting how the organization of the group came about, because I mean, any organization has got to have a hierarchy to it. I mean, you can't all be one man going and everybody talking about everybody else. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. I mean, we got that now in some of the democratic cities.
Okay, there we go. Yeah,
Well, what it really does significantly do is stamp the very beginning that God is a God of order.
yeah.
That's the big thing, and detail order,
Yeah.
right down to the feathers on a particular type of bird. I mean, God is just a God of sophistication and order, and we see that in the family structure, in the elder structure, the structure again of the church in the New Testament, the significance of the differentiation of the roles.
Yeah.
So God tells us that, look, this is the way things should be done, in order and at my discretion, how I want you to do this. So
And they work.
And they work.
If
That's
we,
right.
if we.
They always work.
Yeah.
Well, you were comparing the two things. I was thinking, there was a building of relationship there that took place before the other development.
And the relationship, like, again, you remember Moses' progression, right? He wanted to, he was like Prince of Egypt, he wants to deliver his people, they reject him, he goes 40, now he's 80, and now God says, now you're gonna do it, and he's like, oh, I can't. But then God uses the man. In his old age, he does it, he delivers the people, you know. And what we're seeing is, you know, God may call people to extraordinary things, but that's not the normative thing. It's like, he needs help. And even Moses needed an advisor, you know, and it took an outsider, and sometimes it does, and that's, you know, I always advise pastors. I used to be on credentials committees, which helps ordain guys and stuff, and I always said, you need a man outside your church.
Respect it.
Because you need to be able to speak freely, not gossip, but so that they can speak into your life. You know? And then the other thing is, like, I read you from Timothy, right? So Paul is speaking to Timothy, and Timothy is told to set up elders, right? And so what you have is, like, everybody should kind of view themselves as a Timothy, like, who's your Paul? Or Moses, who's your Jethro? And then, who are you discipling under? You know? So no matter, even if you're at the top, you have somebody speaking into your life. And, you know, I think God does that in a beautiful way. He gives Moses, it's almost like a friend for us. You know, even though he's his father-in-law and his elder, it's like the guy's his friend. Remember, like, who could Moses really trust out of millions of people when he's making all these decisions? And so God gives him that. And to me, it speaks of the humanity of the leader, of Moses. And I was going through the library, and I found this book, and it's called Dangerous Calling. And what I found is my job has become very much, I'm reading a lot of commentaries, a lot of biblical books and the Bible a lot, because I'm always preparing lessons, whether it's for meetings or for Wednesday nights or for Sundays. But like my sort of devotional, just non-very heavy intellectual reading has really gone down. And so I saw this book, and I was like, Dangerous Calling, Confronting the Unique Challenges of Pastoral Ministry. I'm like, yeah, I haven't read a book like that in a while. So I took it home. I said, I'll leave it at, and then when I'm sitting at home, I can pick it up, right? And so I open to the first page, and I see the recommendations by the celebrity pastors that recommended it. I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean by the well-known pastors that recommended it. And my heart sank. So it's called Dangerous Calling. I don't know if you could see those names. Does anything jump out at you with those names?
Can't see, they're all white.
You can't see
James
it.
McDonald,
No, I can't see it.
Joshua Harris.
Several of them have fallen from the faith.
Yeah,
Daniel
Yeah.
Aiken, Tullian Trevigian, Burke Parsons, Joshua Harris, and James McDonald.
yeah.
Josh Harris.
So this was written in 2012 about pastors not, to prevent them from falling from grace. And the whole premise of the book is pastors need Jesus too. And we think we're experts, and we're teaching the congregation all this stuff, and we forget it applies to us. And the irony is not lost on me. And I'm not saying this in a snarky way. I'm not saying I don't want us to talk bad about these guys. I'm just saying it's not lost on me that the guys that are recommending this book, he had an affair or multiple affairs. He's an atheist now. Hopefully he'll come back to the faith. And he was removed from his church for abuse of power and all kinds of unethical stuff. And I'm thinking,
Wow.
whoa. So of course when this book was reprinted in 2016, they didn't use those guys. But like, folks, it's like that 1 Corinthians 10 passage we've read over and over, talking about the Exodus, and these are written as examples for you. Everyone take heed,
Lest you fall.
lest you fall. Don't think you stand, lest ye fall, to Christians, right? So here, this is it's Hebrews 3. Take care, brothers. In other words, the assumption is these are Christians. Take care, brethren, lest there be any of you, an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God, but exhort one another every day. So what's sort of the cure for the unbelieving heart? But exhort one another every day.
Daily exhortation.
To have others in your life, speaking into your life. Moses couldn't be an island unto himself. He had to have help, and he had to have people speaking into his life. And the same thing is from your pastors, the same thing for anyone, And there's all kinds of destruction that'll come. It's not just that Moses will get burnt out. If I start thinking I'm doing this thing alone, what that does is it breeds a self-righteousness.
Yeah.
Then I can no longer see my sin and how I'm unbelieving, and now I'm speaking to a bunch of sinners, and I think I'm not. And that's where you get into the place of these guys, where you think you're above your own teaching, and you justify it in your mind. And I'll just read you some of the justifications. He's using examples. So the pastor who has just become angry during an elders meeting will tell himself he wasn't angry. He was just speaking like one of God's prophets. Thus says the Lord. Or the husband and wife who are gossiping about someone in their small group all the way home from the meeting will tell themselves that it isn't gossip. It's just a very extended and detailed prayer request. So let's pray about it. The tight-fisted businessman who struggles to be giving will tell himself that he is just being a good steward of the resources that God has entrusted to him. We all have a very perverse ability to make ourselves feel good about what is in no way good. And so we all, be careful that we don't think we stand lest we fall. And so I think that's the lesson. We need each other. I appreciate your encouragement. I appreciate you all speaking into my life. I'm hoping to do that to y'all. And yet I see it's very difficult with a church of 300 to 400 people. Like, I can't be in everybody's life that intimately. We're not a church of 100, But I definitely try to get to know people and just be among them. So I appreciate the Wednesday crowd particularly because you give me that opportunity to get to know you. When I get to walk around and eat with you or joke with you here, it's good. It's good.
And George, you're not long-winded. I was joking.
Thank you. See, that's encouragement. Jesse, will you close us?